Hello, back on my priest, and I'm going to try making just a simple aura today that tracks a trinket. So that's this one here, Necromantic Focus. And it works pretty much like any other stacking trinket. You damage a mob, you get a stacking buff, and it goes to a certain amount. And then once it's fully stacked, it just stays up as long as you're beating things up. So in this case, Necromantic Focus gives me Mastery, which increases my damage done pretty substantially. See, by default I do 20.4% extra damage with Empowered Shadows. If we just start stacking the trinket, you can see the buff is stacking here. And as my mastery climbs, there we go, it's fully stacked. Now it's 24% extra damage. So if we get out of combat, you can see that's a pretty big, jump in damage. It's something that you would probably want to wait before you cast Empowered Shadows. Or, sorry, cast Mind Blast to put up Empowered Shadows. So I'm going to make an aura that tracks this trinket and lets me know when it's fully stacked. Because 4% extra damage is pretty significant over the course of a fight. So I'm going to start by bringing up WeakAuras. And I think for this one, let's go with Icon. I'll start on more interesting types later, but I'll go for Icon for now. So I'm going to call this Necromantic Focus. And what I want it to do is to appear. I'm going to start by tracking actually by the way most people do it. So I'll just have this appear when you start combat, and it'll display the number of stacks in the corner. So I'm just going to change the font before we start and make it nice and big so it's easy to see in the video. And I'll leave everything else at the defaults. Next thing I'll do is I'll set load options. I'm going to limit this to in combat, priest, and shadow. And I think that'll do just fine. Maybe I'll put player level in there too. Greater than or equal to 85. And so now we need to add a trigger. And this trinket stacks a buff on the player. So that's something we've done before. The buff is named Soul Fragment. And it's on the player. And there are a few other options, but I'm going to leave those for now. And I think let's just try this out. So I'm going to start by attacking the mob. You can see it's stacking up. And as soon as we get out of combat, that's going to go away. Oops, fully stack it. There we go. So there we go, that's working as advertised. Now what else might we want to do with that? When I track procs and buffs and stuff, what I like to do is keep tabs on when they're not the way I expect them to be. So Necromantic Focus is something that's going to be fully stacked 95% of the time when you're in combat. So the way I'm going to make this aura work is to display when I don't have the buff or when it's not fully stacked. And as soon as that gets up to 10, I'll know that it's safe to cast Mind Blast. So it's kind of an alert for me to say, whoa, you might want to put up Empowered Shadows now because you don't have all of your mastery yet. So to do that, I'm going to come back to this trigger section. I'm going to change it just slightly. I'm going to switch the stack count to greater than or equal to 10. And that should do basically nothing except make it hide until it's fully stacked. So you can see I'm stacking up the buff here. And there we go, it's at 10, it's fully stacked. So some people like that for certain kinds of trinkets just to let them know it's all stacked up and ready to go. But I like mine to work sort of the opposite way. I'm going to come back into the triggers and hit inverse. And when you use inverse, it sometimes has issues automatically detecting the icon. It usually fixes itself in combat, but I'm just going to pick one so that it shows up nicely in my list. So Soul Fragment, that'll do. So now what should happen is I can get in combat, and the aura appears immediately. You can see it's stacking up here. and wow, I can't get my 10th. There we go, 10 stacks, and then it disappears. So I would know that it's a good idea to put up empowered shadows now, because I have it all. But as soon as that drops down, and I go back in combat, you can see that it shows up again, just letting me know, hey, your trinket's not stacked yet. Now you notice that it doesn't have the stack count anymore, and that's another issue with inverse. The way I'm going to fix that is to just enter a custom function. So you can come in, just push C in here, and then I'm going to expand this the text editor. And this is standard issue Lua and the WoW API. I don't expect anybody to know this. This isn't sort of a standard skill set. But this basic process works for any trinket like this. So what I'm going to do is say local, or let's say souls count equals select for unit aura player soul fragment return souls count or nothing. And so this code here just goes and looks up the aura or buff soul fragment on the player, and that returns a number of different things, like the name of the buff, who cast it, the stack count, the time remaining, the duration, things like that. The fourth one of those is the number of stacks of that buff. So I'm saying select the fourth item, which is the number of stacks, and store it in something called souls count, and then return it, which would be just a number. And if there is none because I don't have this buff up, or there's no stacks, then just return an empty string. So I'm going to close this. And if we start mind flaying, you can see it's stacking up, and as the stacks gain there, they show up here now. So if you were using a different trinket the same way that I do, you could come in and just type in the name of the buff appropriate for that trinket. Now maybe if you were doing Apparatus of Kaz Rogel, I think is the melee trinket, you would type in the name of the buff it stacks right here. The name Souls Count is completely optional. You can call this almost anything you want, any one word. So that's basics of tracking a buff. It shows sort of 3 different ways that you can do it. And I think I'll do something in another video rather than making this one any longer than it needs to be.